There is a particular kind of pain that does not come from the breakup itself, but from what happens after. It is the shock of seeing someone who could not love you with steadiness suddenly appear in public as if they have become the picture of commitment. They move fast, too fast. They marry quickly. They post the smiles, the vacations, the grand declarations, the polished little symbols of permanence. And if you have lived through narcissistic abuse, that image can do something brutal to the mind. It can make you wonder whether you imagined everything, whether they finally changed, whether the tenderness they refused to give you was somehow reserved for someone better. But in narcissistic dynamics, that is often exactly the illusion you are meant to absorb. Because what looks like a love story from the outside can be functioning as something very different on the inside. Not intimacy, not healing, not growth, more like image repair after a narcissistic injury, more like a rapid rebuild of the persona, more like a public answer to private shame. And once you understand that, the whole picture starts to change. A narcissistic person does not experience the end of a relationship the way a healthier person usually does. There is little honest mourning, little real self-confrontation, little willingness to sit in the discomfort of what was damaged and ask how they helped create it. What they often feel instead is threat to image, threat to superiority, threat to the false certainty they use to keep themselves from collapsing inward. If you left, if you set boundaries, if you stopped believing the story, then the breakup is not just a loss to them, it is exposure. And exposure is intolerable to a person who survives by performance. So they do what performance always does when the curtain starts falling. They rush to build a new set. That is why the next relationship can move at an almost surreal speed. The new partner is idealized, displayed, elevated, announced. Suddenly everything is public, polished, and theatrical. It can look like they found what they were missing all along. It can look like they grew up overnight. It can even look like they are giving this new person the exact life they withheld from you. But what you are often seeing is not a deeper capacity for love. You are seeing the urgency of someone trying to outrun shame by creating visible proof that they are still desirable, still wanted, still winning. And that is where the revenge element begins to make sense. Not revenge in the cartoonish sense. Not always some conscious master plan where they sit down and decide to marry simply to hurt you. It is usually more psychologically fused than that. The marriage can function as retaliation because it restores the image they felt you damaged. It gives them a stage on which to announce that they are fine, flourishing, adored, chosen, envied. It lets them rewrite the story without ever examining the truth of it. And if you happen to see it, hurt over it, compare yourself to it, or doubt your own memory because of it, then the structure has done exactly what it was meant to do. That is why these fast marriages can feel so pointed, because they are not only about the new partner, they are also about the audience, the ex who still carries the wound, the family members who saw cracks, the friends who might know what really happened, the broader social circle that needs to be convinced the narcissist is not the problem. A wedding is powerful in that sense. It is culturally protected. It photographs beautifully. It looks like stability, legitimacy, and emotional seriousness. So for a narcissistic person, it can become the perfect disguise. A sacred institution repurposed as public relations. And that is what makes it so disturbing. Because the new spouse is often not being loved for who they are. They are being used for what they help prove. They prove desirability. They prove status. They prove that the narcissist is still chosen. They prove that the last relationship must not have been that serious, or that you must have been the one who could not hold on to something good. They prove, at least on the surface, that the narcissist remains untouched by the wreckage they leave behind. But a person cannot build a healthy marriage out of the need to silence shame. Eventually, the same internal emptiness that destroyed the last bond begins pressing against the walls of the new one, and that is when the fairy tale starts to darken. Because the new partner often enters under a flood of idealization. They are adored quickly, promised quickly, secured quickly. It feels intoxicating because it is meant to. They are not being invited into something emotionally stable. They are being drafted into a fantasy at full speed, and fantasies move quickly because reality would slow them down. Reality would ask questions. Reality would notice the inconsistencies. Reality would want to know why the previous relationship ended, why the timeline is so rushed, why intimacy seems to be performing for an audience before it has had time to become real. But reality is not what the narcissistic system wants. What it wants is supply, structure, admiration, and narrative control. So the new spouse is pulled into a role before they have any real idea what the role costs. At first, they may feel uniquely chosen. Then gradually, they begin carrying the same invisible burden you once carried. They become responsible for reassurance, for regulation, for keeping the peace, for mirroring the narcissist's specialness, for preserving the image, for ignoring the small fractures that eventually become impossible to ignore. And because the relationship began under so much pressure to look perfect, the new partner can end up even more trapped. That is the part people rarely see. They see the ring, the honeymoon, the declarations. What they do not see is how much cruelty can hide inside a relationship that must be kept looking successful at all costs. They do not see the pressure to never disappoint, never question, never puncture the image. They do not see how quickly adoration can become control once the spouse has been secured. They do not see how marriage, in the wrong hands, can become a cage built out of appearances. So when you look at that new marriage and feel the sting of comparison, it helps to understand what you are actually comparing yourself to. Not real intimacy, not earned healing, often just a more elaborate version of the same pattern. The stage is nicer, the vows are louder, the image is stronger, but the emotional machinery underneath is often painfully familiar. Idealization, possession, expectation, depletion, blame, repetition. That is why the new spouse may, in some ways, suffer even more. Not because your pain was smaller, not because one person had it worse in some measurable way, but because the narcissist now has more to defend, more to prove, and more desperation wrapped around the image of success. The more fragile the internal world, the more intense the need to make the external world look flawless. And whoever is closest to them pays the price for that pressure. This is also why watching them move on so fast can destabilize survivors so deeply. It does not just hurt, it scrambles meaning. It makes you ask the wrong questions. Why was she good enough? Why him? Why marriage now? Why all the devotion now? But those questions assume the new marriage is a genuine emotional progression from what came before. In narcissistic dynamics, it is often less a progression than a pivot away from shame, away from accountability, away from the unbearable feeling of being ordinary, rejected, or exposed. And once you see that, a harder but cleaner truth emerges. They did not find the kind of love they withheld from you. They found a new structure to hide inside. That does not mean the marriage will fail tomorrow. It does not mean every moment inside it is false. Narcissistic relationships can contain real chemistry, real attachment, real moments of tenderness. That is part of why they are so confusing. But confusion should not be mistaken for health. A person can feel intensely attached and still be operating from control, image dependence, and emotional emptiness. A marriage can look legitimate and still be built on fragile foundations. A wedding can be beautiful and still be covering something broken. So the work for you is not to decode whether their new spouse is happier, prettier, more compliant, more impressive, more useful, or more loved. The work is to stop standing in the glow of their performance and calling it truth. The work is to understand that your pain is being activated by the symbolism of the marriage, not necessarily by the reality of it. The work is to stop letting their next stage design rewrite your memory of what they were like behind closed doors, because what heals you is not figuring out their new life. It is returning to your own clarity. It is remembering how much distortion you survived, how much energy you spent trying to make sense of a person who could not love from a stable self, how often your reality was bent around their moods, their needs, their injuries, their hunger for control. And when you remember that clearly enough, the wedding photos start losing some of their power, not because they stop hurting instantly, but because you stop mistaking performance for peace. That is where real detachment begins. Not in bitterness, not in denial, in clarity. You begin to see that their marriage is not a referendum on your worth. It is not evidence that you were the problem. It is not proof that they suddenly became emotionally safe for someone else. It is simply the next chapter in a pattern that depends on reinvention more than reflection. And once you understand that, the comparison starts collapsing under its own weight. Then something gentler becomes possible. You can feel compassion for the new spouse without romanticizing the relationship. You can grieve what you never received without assuming someone else is receiving it in a healthier form. You can stop watching the performance for clues about your value. You can let their image belong to them and return your attention to what is actually yours. Your nervous system, your healing, your truth, your future, your voice. Because in the end, the most painful lie is not that they married quickly. It is the lie that their new marriage means they learned how to love. Very often, it means they learned how to stage the next act faster. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking why they got the fairy tale. You start recognizing that what you escaped was the set.